Welcome to Gypsy Belle's debut Campfire Stories featuring Bloodline Gypsy. This book was written by author Shirley A. Martin. Introduction. 4:47 a.m. 24 hours ago, the trill of the first bird pierced the morning silence. But today, the vast stretch of coastal woodland remains silent. All life in the rainforest is holding its breath. Even the air is still, without a whisper of a breeze, as if it too is afraid of making its presence known. Low to the ground, in the darkness, something heavy prowls the ferns and brambles. The sight of it is as foreign as its scent. The odd shape of its legs and off-kilter gait signals danger as clearly as the red belly of a glossy black spider, or the wedge-shaped head and slit pupil of a pit viper. Death ambles the forest this dawn. On the two-lane blacktop, a mile and a half away, a truck downshifts, changing gears from a slow left turn. The roof bungalows, devilish wolf, small ears, swivel in the direction of the disturbance. It raises its body upright on thick legs. Like flashlights jostled by toddlers, twin beams of light bobble on the valley floor below, winking in and out of sight. It catches the scent of a lone man coming through the open window of the vehicle. The growl that resonates from its barrel chest is thunderous, as if made by a rumble in the earth instead of lungs and a vocal chamber. A cottontail bolts from its hiding place and dashes crazily, unheeded, through the brush. The roof bungalow drops to the ground and begins a swift and purposeful descent toward the wooded basin below. Chapter 1. Susanna. His wife wanted a paternity test from the very minute they received the call about the girl, a 16-year-old whose mother and grandparents were killed in a motorhome accident. She was allegedly his daughter. Face to face with her for the first time in a seedy, cluttered government office, Chandler Shaw realized convincing his spouse this was his child without DNA testing was going to be almost impossible. The kid looked completely alien standing next to him. He was 17 the last time he looked into green eyes with a ring of gold around the irises, Nikolai Henike's eyes, his daughter's grandfather. Her dusky complexion and fall of dark hair brought another jolt of memory. Irina. She was taller than her mother had been, having inherited some of his length of bone. Her features, too, were more refined, hinting toward his Anglo-Saxon heritage, but it was the resemblance to her Hungarian grandfather that struck him the most. The social worker handling the case was a woman named Kate Evans. He could feel the woman's eyes on him now, and it was an uncomfortable intrusion. Chandler and Miss Evans had been in contact on a regular basis over the course of the last 2 weeks. She was efficient, impersonal, and as sharp as a tack. He had assumed the legalities would be cut and dry. Susanna's mother had raised her with the knowledge of who her father was and how to contact him. His name was on the birth certificate. His daughter had stated in an informal hearing that she would be willing to live with her father on a 6-month trial basis. Nevertheless, Chandler's lack of contact and financial support over the last 16 years was, from a legal standpoint, considered abandonment. His credibility was under scrutiny. Miss Evans expected him to prove his worthiness to provide his teenage daughter with a suitable home, especially since Susanna had family. Several aunts and uncles in Sandusky, Michigan, had expressed a readiness to take her into their homes. It was the girl herself who was the backbone of his involvement. She had insisted on making paternal contact, something that intrigued and touched him. He wasn't taking any chances. He retained a lawyer to walk him through the procedures and make sure all the paperwork was in order. It was also a subtle way of letting Miss Evans know he was perfectly willing to play hardball, and finances were of no concern. Following the brief introduction, Chandler reached out to shake Susanna's hand. It seemed awkward and formal. She extended a slender arm and laughed suddenly at the overwhelmingness of it all. He laughed as well. It warmed things up a little. He had arranged to take her out to lunch for their first meeting, and he was anxious to be alone with her. He confirmed his intentions with Miss Evans and signed the paper she quietly shoved in his direction. The daughter of Irina Henike was his child, but up until September 23rd, she would remain a ward of the state. Miss Evans' crisp blue eyes drifted from him to the teenager. A notable softening of expression came over her face. It sat wrong with him, having a stranger between them. Chandler shot the social worker a dismissive glance and led his daughter out of the office and into the hazy Southern California sunshine. Walking through the parking lot, away from the cluster of high rises, he laid his hand on Susanna's back, navigating her to where he had parked his cherry red Hummer. He was encouraged by her response. She leaned gently into his touch. It was a reaction that both exhilarated him and made him uncomfortably aware of his half grown offspring's femininity. Children change a lot between the ages of 9 and 16. Chandler had forgotten to calculate those changes. Hidden in a toolbox in the rafters of his four-car garage was an envelope full of pictures taken by a detective he had hired to track down the Henniker family in 2005. They were pictures of a scrawny, boyish-looking 9-year-old with a wide mouth and a tangle of brown hair. He had studied each one to memory. The one he stared at the most was a shot taken of his daughter walking with two girls her own age at what looked to be a festival. She was eating a snow cone and looking back toward the photographer as if something had attracted her attention. Her eyes were oblong and deep set, their color hidden from the camera by the slant of the sun. The angles and planes of her face were oddly beautiful just then, in that moment, frozen on Kodak paper, a hint of the woman she would someday become. Eyeing her as she paced beside him, he noticed puberty had softened the angles of her face. Her hair had darkened with age. The chestnut color of her youth was being replaced by a dark sooty brown, giving it a two-tone look. It had grown down to her elbows, the added length and straightened the curls to waves, curls she had inherited from him. Irina's hair had been as smooth as black granite. She smelled of some kind of perfume. Her blouse was cut just low enough to reveal the soft swell of cleavage. There was an unmistakable curve of thigh and flare of hip that screamed female sexuality. He would not be holding her on his lap or tucking her into bed at night. Moments that had never come were already gone forever. He opened the door and she slid into the Hummer. The lock clicked securely into place when the door shut. Kate stood at the window and watched as father and daughter left to become acquainted for the first time. The situation with Chandler Shaw and his young daughter was hopeful. He and the girl's mother had parted ways as teenagers. There had never been any custody battles accompanied by accusations of neglect or abuse. There was no history of drugs or alcoholism. He was an elegant, well-educated man. Kate had found done enough homework to know he owned two hotels and a huge chunk of stock in Big Bear Lake's premier ski resorts. He was charming and generous, casual yet expensively dressed, modestly downplaying his own wealth. His response regarding paternity and guardianship over his illegitimate child had been without the slightest hesitation. Kate knew Chandler Shaw was married and had two young sons. He lived in what he had so casually hinted a lakeside mansion. Not only would his teenage daughter have her own room, but she would also have her own wing, he had added, chuckling to take some of the sting out of the brag. He was quick to point out that he and his wife were church-going Christians, and they supported a youth organization where he also donated his time counseling troubled teens. Kate chewed her lip thoughtfully as the Hummer turned out of the parking lot and into a line of traffic. The windshield and high-gloss painted glinted in the muted sunlight. This was a man who painted a pretty picture of himself. Susanna's family had lived in Sonora, in Northern California. When it was established the minor wanted to make contact with her father in Big Bear, she had been escorted down to Southern California by a Tulum County social worker. It was a personal favor from Kate's longtime friend and colleague, Gretchen Swanson, who had several years prior moved up to Twain Harte. Kate had first set eyes on the Hennigan girl standing next to Gretchen in the hall. She was clinging to a guitar case as if it was a portal to her past life. Grief-stricken and solemn, she was an intense-looking girl with odd-colored eyes that lingered too long on passing faces, as if searching for answers in details of bone and flesh. Kate and Gretchen embraced, and Kate introduced herself to the teenager and led the way back to her office. Gretchen excused herself, but not until she made eye contact with Kate. "Meet me at Sandy's," she asked, and Kate knew she wanted to talk. Sandy's was a bar and grill that had been their haunt when they were both rookies, back in the day when some of the cases they were involved with had taken such an emotional toll they sought each other's company after work, accompanied by large quantities of alcohol. Kate raised her eyebrow, curious at her longtime friend's request. Susanna took a seat in the office to wait for the finalizing of paperwork and for her foster mother to pick her up. Kate had been pleased that Molly MacDonald had a bed available. She was a warm, compassionate woman and integrated her foster children with her own family with uncommon ease. Susanna would be staying with Molly for 3 or 4 weeks until all of the legalities of paternal custody were established. Only once Kate looked up to find the girl's eyes on her. She had never seen eyes that shade of green before. Their steady gaze was unsettling. The teenager smiled a tiny, apologetic smile, as if somehow sensing she was the source of unease, and turned her head back toward the window. Kate watched as her hand trailed across the handle of the guitar case, absently securing some kind of comfort from it. She had white hands. Her fingernails were ragged and indented from the guitar strings. She clenched the handle briefly, then turned it loose and swiped at her hair self-consciously. Kate was beginning to think she knew exactly what Gretchen was going to say the minute she plopped her butt down next to her on that bar stool at Sandy's. Boy, I'm telling you what, Kate, if there was any way in hell, I would keep this one. It was easy for Chandler to get over his nervousness once they were in the Hummer. He felt a surge of control he had been struggling to maintain in the office. With his daughter beside him in the passenger seat, he drove through the city streets. He was aware she kept stealing glances at him. From the corner of his eye, he could see the side of her face turn his way and the cascade of her hair. You look so much like your grandfather, he could not help saying. She smiled comfortably for the first time in his company. Yeah, I know, she admitted. It was clear she had heard this many times before. She was wearing a frayed sage green blouse with a scalloped hem that clung to her hips, faded blue jeans with ragged holes in the knees, and scuffed brown boots. Comfort clothes. Clothes she had probably worn countless times in the company of her family, maybe even bringing back a memory of some special occasion. With a swift, brief insight, he realized it would be months or even years before she was really his. He took her to the Macaroni Grill. It was the boys' favorite place to eat whenever they were off the mountain, and he felt like it was a way of easing her into customs that were to be a part of her new life. Parking the car, he asked her one of the questions that had been burning a hole through him since he had first talked to Kate Evans. So, your mother told you about me? The words sounded more casual than he felt. She talked about you all the time when I was little, Susanna answered, turning her full attention to him. What did she say? Chandler cringed inwardly. He could not believe he just threw that out there like that. Was he even ready for the answer? No, no, he didn't think so. But there was no retracting the question. His daughter was studying him thoughtfully. She said you were just a kid back then when she got pregnant, and you didn't have the support of your family like she did, Susanna said frankly. Chandler took in a deep breath that stalled on the exhale. Did she ever say why she never tried to contact me over all of those years? Mom always said you would find us when you were ready. Suddenly, her eyes on him made him feel skinless. There was no way she could know he had found them 7 years ago, and he had opted not to make contact. Peter, his oldest son, had been just a toddler, and Penelope, his wife, was pregnant with Sammy, their second child. It would have thrown his life into turmoil and put an incredible stress on his marriage. Still, he felt flushed with guilt. Irina would never know she had been in part right, that he had, in fact, tracked them down. Chandler fiddled with the gearshift knob and glanced out the rearview mirror. Heart-to-heart honesty wasn't his thing. His comfort zone was behind a wall of pleasantries and pretenses. He was not a man who let people in. He unbuckled his seatbelt and shot Susanna a glance. You ready to go into the restaurant? He asked, a little more light-heartedly. I'm going to be 17 in November, she said. I would hate to be held accountable my whole life for something I did right now. Her gaze returned to his. He saw a flash of that strange Henika eye color. Had she just forgiven him for his lifelong absence in her life? He felt out of control again. He nodded lamely and opened the car door. Susanna seemed content to follow suit and climb out into the late summer's warmth. Walking through the parking lot to the restaurant, she assumed a position close to his side. Back in form by the time they reached the entrance, Chandler Shaw emanated the persona of a man comfortable with authority. He smiled at his daughter and gently brushed his hand down the length of her hair as he held the door open for her. The Hummer handled the curves on the mountain road as a $70,000 vehicle should, With its wide wheelbase and low center of gravity, Chandler felt secure climbing the mountain in the late afternoon, 20 to 30 miles over the posted speed limits. On his way home to his family, after returning Susanna to Kate's office, he tried to get a take on what impression his daughter would have on his wife. Penelope was a model by the time she was 14. She retired only when she began to show in her pregnancy with Peter. She had remained extremely fashionable and body conscious. She would be uninterested in and even embarrassed by a stepdaughter who was unsightly, plain, or God forbid, jiggling with cellulite. Susanna was none of the above, but too pretty might erupt a different set of issues. It was hard for Chandler to have an unbiased opinion of his daughter. Sitting across from him at the table as she became more relaxed, insight into her personality and mannerisms began to reveal her as an earthly, soft natured girl. Nothing like her mother's fiery, sharp witted personality or her grandfather's intimidating persona. She seemed to have inherited some of the shyness and introversion Chandler suffered from when he was a boy, something he could instantly relate to. Susanna asked a barrage of questions and was especially intrigued by the fact that she had two half brothers. Chandler had a million questions of his own, but he didn't want to stir up recent grief and emotions bringing up the life his daughter had led with her mother. He left his questions unspoken and fell into an easy cadence of telling her all about Peter and Sammy and his life in the mountains. Pausing to eat between conversations, he watched her tear a piece of rosemary bread and dip it into olive oil. Another jolt of recognition. She had his hands. Chandler found himself thinking of Irina and how in love with their daughter she must have been, how devastated she would have been to know she would be leaving Susanna at such a young age. The accident report said she was dead on arrival. Did that mean she had died instantly, or had she known about the crash? Had some vague of awareness penetrated her consciousness? He liked to think she would have been comforted to know he was here for Susanna now, and he was taking their daughter home and raising her with her brothers. He could see where Penelope might find Susanna's coloring and features too extreme for beauty. Her body, not quite tall enough and too shapely for model material, completely contrasted Penelope's own 5'11" and 120-pound frame. The girl was obviously stamped with the genetic characteristics of her mother's side of the family, a woman Chandler had had a sexual relationship with and a pregnancy he had kept secret. He winced a little at the memory of admitting to his wife that yes, he did believe the orphan teenager was his, and he had known through all of the years of his marriage. She was out there, somewhere. It had been the rockiest road their relationship had had to traverse so far. After months of counseling and subjecting the matter to their pastor's scrutiny and petitioning the support of their church, the marriage still teetered. With Penelope, any reaction was possible. Chandler considered it a tragic but wonderful fate that had brought about the chain of events that ended with Susanna in his life. But he knew one thing for certain. If his wife got the slightest whiff of how excited and happy he was to resume guardianship of his illegitimate child, his marriage would suffer, his children would suffer, and none so profoundly as Susanna herself. Chandler knew he had to have complete control of his emotional state by the time he pulled into the driveway that night. Taking Susanna in was the Christian thing, the right thing to do. He was allowed compassion, but it was duty that motivated him to bring the girl into their home. He would have to be very careful. His wife was a jealous woman. She was capable of ruining an entire family vacation over a flare of jealousy caused by too much attention bestowed on her own children by their father. There would be little tolerance of his affections toward another woman's child. He had to keep his guard up, now more than ever. Everything that mattered in his life depended on it. Susanna had never been much of a sleeper. She became restless when the sun set and darkness settled in. Homeschooled most of her life because of her family's nomadic lifestyle, she had grown comfortable with the world in the blackest hours of the night. She often slept well into the morning, lulled to sleep by the rocking of the RV. Daylight was safer for sleeping and less interesting than the darkness that flew into view of the motorhome's headlights. Sometimes she saw the glowing eyes of some nocturnal creature or a snake slithering across the blacktop. She was always wide awake at midnight, sitting between the driver and the passenger seat, where she could see out the windshield. While her grandparents slept and her mother drove, it was Susanna's job to ride shotgun. Just the two of them, mother and daughter, watching the black horizon unfold in the Fleetwood's high beams. They would talk about all sorts of goofy stuff to keep her mother from getting sleepy. Sometimes they would stop for gas and buy fragrant smelling cups of coffee and eat refreshing peppermint patties to combat fatigue. They were fair folk following the Renaissance fairs across the country. Her grandfather was a leather craftsman specializing in leather armor. He also made belts, pouches, boots, and a variety of other accessories in demand for Renaissance costumes. Her mother told fortunes. Her grandmother, the one responsible for the black eyes and sharp wit Irina had inherited, managed their engagements and was their accountant. Susanna played guitar. Her grandfather taught her the basics on his violin. She had wanted to play something she felt was more contemporary. She received a guitar for Christmas, she translated all her musical knowledge over to the six-string instrument she could play with all 10 of her fingers, instead of one hand and a bow. It came as easily to her as breathing. By the time she was 14, on a good day at the fair, she could make several $100s in tips. As far back as Susanna could remember, she felt like she was set apart from the rest of the world. As a small child, she was content with solitude, and she shied away from crowds and gatherings. Amusement parks and birthday parties, normal childhood activities, caused her to recoil into herself. Making friends was never easy. When she was 7, a friend of her mother's had taken Susanna, her daughter, and another girl their age to San Francisco for the day. Susanna's first trip to a big city, she had been so ill at ease with the congestion, the traffic, and the crowds, she threw up on the sidewalk. She craved the country and the wide open spaces of the farmlands where her family lived when they were not on the road. Her grandfather had bought a house in an old orchard just outside of Sonora. She would spend hours climbing the twisted old apple trees, enthralled by the sifting of the sunlight through the quivering leaves, the clear blue summer sky, and the puffy white clouds hanging low over the foothills. Sometimes she would find the silhouette of her own shadow cradled safely high in the branches of a tree, a girl-shaped splotch in dappled sunlight. People seemed to shy away from her with just one look at her odd-colored eyes and her quiet ways. The guitar changed all of that. Her musical talent made allowances for her eccentricities. Once someone heard her play, that person would never view her in the same way again. She became accepted, looked at with eyes of longing instead of dismissal, especially among the fair folk who, like carnies of old, had created a world unto themselves, a more accepting and open-minded world than mainstream America, a place where the different had their own little niche in modern times. It was a complete culture shock staying with a temporary foster family. Kate Evans had told her she was lucky Molly MacDonald had room available. Susanna realized this was probably true. Molly had a half-acre of property in Norco, California, complete with dogs, horses, and chickens. She had teenagers of her own as well, but they interested Susanna less than the animals. Susanna had always loved horses. As a very small girl, she dreamed of riding in the Renaissance tournaments, dressed in silks and satins, astride a magnificent horse. At Molly's, at least she had the horses. She spent every minute of the day, from dawn to dusk, in the quaint four-stall horse stable. She would ride in the arena, brush the horses, and muck out the stalls. Molly paid her $5 a day for doing chores, which included collecting multicolored eggs from an assortment of hens. In the evening, Susanna would sit alone in the dark, dusty confines of the hay barn, the family mongrels choosing the heat of the stable rather than the shade of a tree, to be at her side, panting their devotion. It was different at night. Dinner with the family was tolerable. She had not really connected with the 3 other young people who lived in the house, but their relationship was peaceful. Molly's kids were used to Foster's coming and going. They were wrapped up in their own lives that seemed to mostly revolve around high school friends and social activities that took them away from home. Susanna wondered what could interest them more than the rural life their mother had provided right here smack dab in the middle of the smog-infested suburbs. She guessed it was normal for teenagers not to take notice of privileges provided freely. She thought to herself, until it was all whisked away in the blink of an eye. Everything was locked down and lights out at 10. Late at night, with everyone asleep, the house was quiet. Susanna felt painfully self-conscious just making her way down the hall to the bathroom. On this night it was windy, that odd-feeling wind Californians called the Santa Anas. She had picked the bed closest to the window so she could look up at the huge elm tree that grew in the backyard. She loved the sound of the wind blowing through the leaves and scuffing at the panes. Tomorrow she would be going home with her father and meeting her 2 half-brothers and her father's wife, her stepmother. The first day of a whole new life. She had spent a couple of afternoons getting to know Chandler Shaw. They went out to dinner once or twice and spent an entire day at the San Diego Zoo, ending with a sunset walk on the beach. They talked for hours that night in the car, parked on a bluff where they could watch the moon follow the sun into the ocean. He had gotten her home late, but it seemed there had been a tiny bit of rebellious intrigue between them when they said good night, and he warmly squeezed her hand before heading back to the Hummer. Her father was tall and fine boned, with hair the same tone of brown as hers, only several shades lighter. His skin was remarkably fair, and his eyes were a cloudy shade of blue gray. He had a way of looking at her and touching her in little ways. He would brush her cheek with the back of his fingers or pull her hair gently. The expressions of affection made her think she understood why all those years ago her mother had fallen in love with him. Irina had been just a few years older then than Susanna was now. She felt a strange connection with her mother when she looked at her father, trying to see him through Irina's eyes, imagining them together, remembering some of the stories her mother told Susanna about him when Susanna was little and they were cuddled up in bed on cold winter mornings. With time, they had talked about him less and less, although not a single birthday went by that Susanna hadn't looked for a card that might miraculously come in the mail, or kept her eyes peeled for a strange car that might pull up to the house one evening. In him, there was also recognition of herself. Sometimes she saw one of her own expressions cross his face, or even just a familiarity in the way he moved or walked. Nervous exhaustion began taking its toll. Often she still cried herself to sleep. Tonight she listened to the sound of the Santa Anas. It was soothing, all that turmoil outside. She succumbed to dozing off, letting the wind thrash out the intensity of her emotions in the wildly waving branches of that gigantic tree. End of chapter 1. That was the introduction and the first chapter of Bloodline Gypsy, Jook and Gypsies Vol.1, written by author Shirley A. Martin. You can go to the links below to get your own copy.